it was like a Pauline moment. Like I saw it, like, oh my gosh, like I'm an emotional infant leading this church.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to raise up mothers and fathers of the faith. And, it's a joke. And that's what I saw. Emotional health and spiritual maturity can't be separated. That it's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And when I saw that, I started with me and I realized that's the gap that we just accept.
Hey, podcast family, and welcome to episode number 290 of the L3 Leadership Podcast, where we are obsessed with helping you grow to your maximum potential and to maximize the impact of your leadership. My name is Doug Smith, and I am your host, and today's episode is brought to you by my friends at Baritone Advisors. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you'll enjoy our content and become a subscriber. And if you've been listening to us for a while, thank you so much. It means the world to me that you're a listener, and it would also mean the world to me if you would leave us a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts through. That really does help us to grow our audience and reach more leaders, so thank you in advance for that. Well, leader, in today's episode, you'll hear my conversation with Pete Scazzero. I was looking forward to this conversation for a long time because I've been so deeply impacted by Pete's books, and the conversation did not disappoint. And for those who may be unfamiliar with Pete, let me just tell you a little bit about him. Pete Scazzero, after leading New Life Fellowship Church for 26 years, co-founded Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, a groundbreaking ministry that moves the church forward by slowing the church down in order to multiply deeply changed leaders and disciples. Pete hosts the top-ranked Emotionally Healthy Leader podcast, and he's also the author of a number of best-selling books, including The Emotionally Healthy Leader, which I highly recommend, and Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I, in fact, recommend all of his books. They're fantastic. Pete and his wife, Geri, also developed the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship Course, Parts 1 and 2, which is a powerful resource that helps move people from a shallow to deep relationship with Jesus. For more information on everything that Pete's doing, you can visit emotionallyhealthy.org or connect with Pete on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Pete Scazzero. Pete and Geri remain vital members of New Life Church. And in this interview, you'll hear Pete and I talk about his journey to becoming an emotionally healthy leader, which has been a huge emphasis in my life. How can I become emotionally healthy? And he shares with leaders how they can take that same journey. And leaders, I can't think of a more vital topic right now that we all need to be going through. If you have not gone through Pete's work, please do it. Please take your team through it. You will be a better leader as a result. Your team will love you for it. Your team will be better as a result of them going through it. I truly believe that every leader needs to work through Pete's framework. So you're going to love this interview. I do want to preface the conversation by just saying that we did have a few internet issues that impacted the audio throughout the interview. However, I don't think it impacted it enough, and I think the content is fantastic enough that it was worth publishing, and I think that, other than a few issues with the audio, you'll really enjoy this interview. So I apologize in advance for that. And before we get into the interview, just a few announcements. This episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Baritone Advisors. The financial advisors at Baritone Advisors help educate and empower clients to make informed financial decisions. You can find out how Baritone Advisors can help you develop a customized financial plan for your financial future by visiting their website at baritoneadvisors.com. That's BERATUNG advisors.com. Securities and investment products and services offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA and SIPC. Baritone Advisors, LPL Financial, and L3 Leadership are separate entities. I also want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They're a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny. And my wife, Laura, and I got our engagement and wedding rings at Henny Jewelers, and we just loved our experience. And not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people. In fact, for every couple that comes in engaged to their store, they give them a book to help them prepare for marriage, and we just love that. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. And with all that being said, here's my conversation with Pete Scazzero. Enjoy. Well, hey, thank you so much, Pete, for being willing to do this interview. And why don't we just start off with you just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Who I am? Wow. That's a big question. I'm a pastor at heart. I pastored for 26 years, lead pastor of a local church. And since then, I've transitioned after succession to leading a ministry we call Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, which is really equipping pastors and leaders to multiply deeply changed leaders and disciples. So that's really our work out of our 40 plus years. seeking to bring in a change. The church needs a new culture. Okay, so our mission is out of the pastor and leader, him or herself, introduce a new way of doing church, a new culture out of their inner life that we trust will be able to weather the storms, whatever's happening externally around us.
Yeah. And you've really become known for this. You've written several books. You've written The Emotionally Healthy Leader, The Emotionally Healthy Relationship, Spirituality, Discipleship, and Church. The book I'm going to focus a lot on today is Emotionally Healthy Leader. And leader, if you're listening or watching this, please get this book. And in fact, I would encourage you to get all the books in Pete's series. But yeah, what really prompted you to even write the first book and really start this movement?
I had a great seminary education. I was very blessed. I was on staff at the Varsity Christian Fellowship in my early years after college. And so I had a really good parachurch ministry formation in terms of making disciples, sharing the gospel, teaching, inductive Bible study, and then went to seminary and had a great seminary education. And then launched the church plant after learning some Spanish in Latin America in 1987. And so what happened was we pastored it, but by year 6 and 7, we clearly hit a wall in the way we were doing discipleship and leadership development. So we had a crash. You mentioned, Doug, you had one, well, we had one. Ours was slow burn. More than a crash, it was a wall that we hit, a wall, and we recognized that people were not deeply changing in our church. We were recycling a lot of the same old problems. We were in a multiracial inner city situation, so we had people from 70 plus countries in the church, and we were very seriously dealing with racial reconciliation. So you had Chinese, you had Filipinos, you had African Americans, you had Latinos, you had Palestinians, you had Jews. I mean, it was a real mix. And we were living in community and growing and actually multiplying churches. And that's when I realized that evangelical discipleship, as we presently do it, doesn't deeply change people to actually address issues like racism or classism, or where people are going to shift their whole lifestyle because of the gospel. Hitting that wall and then recycling the same old problems and being very exhausted, my wife being tired of being a single parent. So on a personal level and a leadership level, we were at a wall and knew that up to that point, what we had learned, and we'd learned a lot. I mean, we felt like we had done all the best leadership stuff that was out there up to that point, but it wasn't working. Something was clearly missing. We just didn't know what it was. So we went on this journey, for a couple of years of like really wrestling with something's really wrong here. And you understand, like we were deep in Bible study, early morning prayer meetings, prophetic signs and wonders, intense Bible study, gifts of the Spirit. I mean, we were in it all. There was nothing that we were not deliverance committed to, because they're all biblical and have their place. But all of those paradigms are, while biblical, there was still something else missing that we could not get a handle on. And so in 1994, so basically after like a year 6 or 7, we hit this wall when it started with one of our church plants split, 200 people left. And that's when I found myself very angry and depressed. And, the experience of betrayal unleashed a flurry of emotions inside of me. And I was in a spiritual crisis because I didn't know what to do with my rage, my bitterness, my hatreds. Pastor preaching the love of Jesus, but not knowing how to do it. That's when I began to look inside that maybe I got some problems, which was a new idea for me. It wasn't just all out there. That's what got us to the point, at least anyway, to like, oh, God set us up.
Yeah. And so you're in that place. And so, what happened next that was so enlightening that obviously led to all these books?
Let's imagine this. It was a 2-year period. I'm kind of on this inner journey. I actually go to a Christian counselor. I'm trying to do feelings a bit, and what am I feeling? That was a new idea.
Yeah.
I discovered the Psalms at that point, obviously David, raging, bitter, depressed, that was a whole new thought. I'm reading people like Henry Nouwen. I'm realizing that, I'm seeing certain things, but it's mostly in my head at that point, I'm like, yeah. Then 2 years into this kind of inward journey, what really got me was my wife came to me and she quit the church and she said, I'm not doing this anymore. Your leadership stinks. And this church gives me death, not life. So that
Wow.
was the moment that like, oh God, like the bottom really fell out. And so, we went away for a week to a place where, fallen pastors go, two therapists and us for a week. And
Hmm.
in that week, God met us. I mean, they kept talking about our marriage. I'm like, well, why are you talking about our marriage? Like, straighten my wife out. Let's get over it. And but God met us, and that's when it all kind of, my 2 years of pondering it all, like it's like it was like a Pauline moment. Like I saw it, like, oh my gosh, like I'm an emotional infant leading this church,
Hmm.
and I'm trying to raise up mothers and fathers of the faith, and it's a joke. And that's what I saw. Emotional health and spiritual maturity can't be separated. That it's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And when I saw that, I started with me and I realized that's the gap, that we just accept immature behaviors, defensive, irritable, unloving, judgmental behaviors. But as long as you're anointed and gifted and a great leader with, or apparently great leadership gifts and capacities and skills, and you can build an organization or a church, hey, we need you. We'll overlook some things for the sake of that. And we finally, that crisis brought us to, I think, I'd say a biblical understanding of, like, you can't separate these two things. And so that was revolutionary for us. And then, of course, for the rest of our lives, last 26 years.
So walk us through the journey to emotional health for you. So all of a sudden you kind of hit this wall,
Yeah.
You had a dark night of the soul. And so you started searching, and then obviously you went to counseling. And so that set you forth on this journey. What did you discover? And what do you really share through these books and content, that how do people grow up emotionally? I think about so many friends in ministry, and even me, we have these wrong metrics of success. I told you I burned out last year and had a mental breakdown, and I'm on the same path. I'm on the path that you were on. And it's just like, okay, what do I need to really implement in my life to become emotionally mature, to make sure I develop my character where it needs to be, make sure I measure success correctly? What did that journey look like for you? And what did you discover with your wife?
And just, we're still on it. Just, I want to be clear, because it at its essence, it's a theological paradigm. I call it biblical missing pieces. So our work and contribution to the global leadership and discipleship discussion is, for many reasons that are complex and historical, the Western church, and the American church in particular, has been so shaped by our culture that we don't even see some very clear things in scripture about what leadership is, what spirituality is, what discipleship is. And I think from us, our journey and the pain of our journey, because we were evangelical poster children, was we had done everything pretty much that was out there, and we're hitting a wall and stuck, and our people were stuck. And so I think our soil was so good. We were so open and right. I don't think you have to beat at a wall to receive this stuff, but that we realized we were not going to pretend anymore. We're not going to lie anymore. We were done caring what people think, worrying about that. We were going to go on this journey of, one, honesty, not pretending, integrity. We call it emotional health. And the reason, just, it's interesting, it got branded emotional health, but really for us, it's integrity. We live what we speak. If we're not living it, we don't speak it. And so, but it comes out of the leaders first, and then it flows out to the church. So we began to get into things like biblical things like slowing down to be with God and yourself, out of which you can be with other people. So we ended up digging into monasticism and the riches of the slow down monastic tradition, Christian history, which is very rich. Things like silence, solitude, and Sabbath. So people are aware of what's going on inside of them. What am I feeling? Being reflective, silence and solitude. These are not things that we do very much within most churches. We're just get it done, take the next hill. And so that was gigantic. Be before you do, we call it. And then we got into things like, so it's not just this contemplative, slow down spirituality or slow down life. Then secondly, is a whole emotional health piece, digging that out. Like, we began to talk about how we meet God through our feelings. Learning to feel. I mean, that was gigantic. And our capacity to feel is our capacity to love. So, for example, the Bible's got a massive amount of stuff on grief and loss. 2/3 of the Psalms, a whole book called Lamentations. But we don't do grief and loss. We do up and to the right. So how could that be? It's so clear in the Bible. It's everywhere in the Bible. Well, again, we're just blinded by our time in history we live in and Western culture. Things like we began to do genograms, or we began to develop something called a genogram of, we go back to go forward. We look at our family of origin, called Face Your Shadow in the leader book, and how our past history impacts who we are today. So we began to develop some tools on how to help people. Again, we were looking at ourselves first, that we realized that I was so unaware of my family of origin's impact on me that my discipleship was shallow, it was thin deep. And thus, because my discipleship was shallow, the whole church's discipleship was shallow. And so we began to develop some tools to get at how your family of origin did life and how that differs from the new family of Jesus. A theology of limits, another big theme. A theology of loving well as the measure of maturity, another big theme. Theology that we lead out of brokenness and vulnerability. Again, we see that in, all over Scripture, in Psalms and David, and so this thing began to get built out, Doug, and just theologically, and it has over the years. And we gave our life to say we are gonna not gonna address all of discipleship, but we're gonna explore and develop tools to disciple people in this arena we call emotional health, and define what it is, some practical tools to help people live it. We just did it for our local church, though. We weren't like trying to conquer the whole world. But then what happened, it hit such a nerve.
Yeah.
I wrote about it, and it went all over. Who knew it was going to hit this nerve all around the world? That was a surprise to us. We thought we were just screwed up in New York, We found out, no, people screwed up everywhere. It's not just us.
Yeah, I want to break some of those things down. The first one, is you talked about discovering your feelings, actually recognizing them. In the book, you talk about you had to name your feelings for the first time in your whole life. I think it's interesting you bring up grief and loss. When I think about my breakdown, I lost my mom when I was 17 years old. I lost my mother-in-law when I was 17, or 2 years later. I lost my sister to an overdose 2 years ago. And when I had this breakdown, through therapy and through meeting with, some of the mentors in my life, I realized my pastor actually told me, he said, Doug, said as a teenager, you basically medicate your life through drugs, your pain, watching your mom get sick. And then basically you met Christ and rededicated your life as a senior in high school when you lost your mom, which was great. But then you started medicating through self-performance. And he goes, I don't know if you've ever actually grieved the loss of anyone in your life. And, I lost my sister 2 years ago. And I just think about, basically, she passed away. I went over, hung out with my dad, made sure he was okay, put together the whole funeral, right? Took care of all that, raised some money for my nephews, and basically went back to work, really without processing anything. So I've kind of been on this journey of identifying my feelings, taking time to grieve. I'm just curious, what did that look like for you, and how did you actually take time to do that?
Yeah, so we were on a pastor's course. What we do in that pastor's course, one of the sessions is called Enlarge Your Soul Through Grief and Loss. So we have people do a grief chart of their historical griefs, right? 0 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 to 20, et cetera, 20 to 40. What were your losses, and how did you react to it at the time? You just explain how you reacted to some of them. And then the question is, how do I begin to grieve these losses? What does it look like to integrate these losses into my spirituality? And I actually would say to you that I'm not sure you can grow into spiritual maturity without biblically grieving your losses. And grieving losses, like, think of it as a person becoming a master chef or a master artist or a master mason or a master electrician. There's a process. You start as an apprentice, then you move on to journeyman, journeywoman, then you become a master over a number of years. But you have to kind of lean into it for a number of years. Well, grief and loss is like that. It's more of an art, and it's a journey. So you may be in your early stages of apprenticing and learning to feel some of your griefs, but it's not easy to lean into grief. It's really hard because it's such a surrender of control. I mean, how do you contain this thing, right? And there's some biblical guidelines of how to deal with grief and loss, which are very important. We'll pay attention to them like David did. or like Jeremiah did, like Jesus did. We feel them deeply before God, and then we wait on the Lord with them, and we allow God to birth the new out of the old. So we don't medicate, we don't avoid, we don't suppress, we don't repress, we don't blame other people. We actually like wrestle with God in them and waiting on Him, and we allow Him to birth something new out of it. There's gold and treasure in grief and loss. In fact, you should.
Wow.
I want to recommend that you do read. There's a chapter called "Discover the Treasures Buried in Grief and Loss." It's in the recent Emotionally Healthy Discipleship book. What I do is my first book was called Emotionally Healthy Church. I wrote that in 2003. And that was after 7 years of kind of living this out in our local church. I wrote that book because no one ever heard of this concept of emotional health. It was like, what are you talking about? And actually the publisher, which was Zondervan, said, please don't use the title emotional health. Like no one's going to buy it. And, no man is going to buy it for sure. And, but the reason I said, we got to keep the title emotional health, we call it healthy, because I'd gone to back to my professors. I had a course at Princeton Seminary on Augustine. Scholar was talking about what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And there's different aspects of that image. We're physical beings, spiritual beings, relational beings, social beings, and we're emotional beings. And that every aspect has to be restored by Jesus. And so I said, I'm going to dig into what does it mean to disciple people in the emotional? People talked about it. That's why I got into things like grief and loss, limits, loving well, genograms, go back to go forward. And we began to develop some skills on how do you help people do their relationships differently. It got really deep. And so I said, let me live it out first, let it age like good wine. And I wrote this initial book, and we thought nobody would, what was it going to do? But, and then what happened was it was 18 years later. And it was really, when I wrote that first book, I was almost like giving a defense of, like, because no one had heard the word. Now emotional health is so popular. Now it's like all the rage.
Right.
How did you discover that word? I'm like, I said, well, it was an accident. I didn't know 20 years later it was going to be all the rage,
Yeah.
So emotionally healthy discipleship, which I rightly said, all everyone around me say, that's the one book that you got to redo. We took it off the market and I rewrote, 75% of it.
Wow.
But it's the pastors and leaders in a theology of what really is the theology underpinnings of what we call emotionally healthy discipleship or spirituality. So again, if you think of emotionally leader, which we're going to talk about right now, is about your person. Emotionally discipleship is the theology undergirding the whole culture. So things like limits, embracing the gift of limits, and discovering the treasures in grief and loss, and leading out of brokenness and vulnerability, etc. So those are kind of some of the themes there. But again, the pastoral leaders got to first live it out themselves. We can go into the leader book if you like too. But that's so what happened. We began on this journey, Doug, of just God had met us so it's such we were so liberated. We like to call it we were born again. And our life got so rich, so wonderful. Jesus and the gospel came so alive. And actually leading was a joy. It was no longer this heavy, hard yoke. And so we have been on this journey putting these pieces together. There's another way to do leadership. There's another way to be a pastor. There's another way to be a leader and build teams and healthy cultures. So we've made a lot of mistakes, obviously. I feel like I write out of my mistakes on the ground. So I don't consider myself I have a fellow I know pretty well. He's a professor, of an MBA program at Harvard. But he's a scholar. Like I'm not. I'm just a guy in the trenches, and I write out of. I try to write as a mentor out of my experience, but I'm not claiming to be the authority by any means. But we have now spent quite a bit of time now on this one area, really exploring it, and I think you're going to hit a wall at some point. Everyone's going to, if you don't deal with the emotional aspects of leadership development and discipleship, people are going to get stuck.
I love the picture you painted that, once you work through some of these things, you were born again, you felt the leadership weight lift off of you. And, one thing I've experienced personally, and I've seen a ton of young leaders experience is we just have these unrealistic expectations of ourselves internally because of how the culture defines success. You specifically named 2 unhealthy commandments in the book that I love, but I think are so relevant. You said, an unhealthy commandment is that something is not a success unless it's always bigger and better. And then what you do is more important than who you are. And I've seen this play out in my life. I have extreme unrealistic expectations internally, and it puts such a weight on me. So can you talk about that journey from, hey, everything has to be up and to the right all the time, or else I'm worthless? Like, how did you process that, and how do you define success now that you're on the other side of that?
Let's just approach it biblically for a moment. I mean, it's just not in the Bible. I mean, let's just think for a second of the first 300 years of the church. I mean, there was periodic persecution, there was scattered, there were small house churches for the most part. In fact, when the early church was growing in number in Jerusalem, 3,000, 5,000, God's not against numbers. But if you remember, they wouldn't scatter. They were building a mega church, and God scattered them. I mean, he said in persecution, he goes, you're not doing what I'm asking you to do. And yet, out of the Enlightenment, American culture, entrepreneurship, we just copy the business models and paste it on church. It's got to go, we measure success by numbers. And yet, if you look at scripture, I mean, Jesus didn't have the numbers. I mean, he's our Lord. They walked away from him in some great numbers, places like John 6, about 1,000. John the Baptist had a great ministry, then it went down. And he was fine. He was, a person can receive only what's given him or her from heaven. You look at Jeremiah, you look at Isaiah, you look at some of Paul's, work as well. What happened to him in Ephesus, and everyone's deserted him. And the point is, I want to give you a redefinition of success in the biblical terms. Success is becoming the person God calls you to become and doing what God calls you to do in his way and according to his timetable. I'll say it again because it's so important.
Yeah.
Success is becoming the person God calls you to become. So in other words, what does that look like for you? That to become Christ-like, to become the unique, there's only one of you in all the earth. Become you, in all the earth. Become that person. So that takes time to beat in prayer and reflection and feeling and all the stuff of whether it's therapy and whether it's spiritual direction, it's mentors, but you're working on your being, because that is the most important gift you can give anybody. You can't give what you don't possess. You can only give what you do possess. And then you do what God's asked you to do. You don't just build your podcast or build your ministry because you're trying to copy somebody else on the biggest podcast on iTunes. So why? What's that about? Maybe God's not asking you to have the biggest podcast on iTunes or the biggest church or biggest nonprofit. What's God asking yours to be? What's the unique charism he's given you, the grace? And that's what you want to be faithful to. And so I realized I got in this journey, like, I could be trying to grow this church to 5,000 and I'll die and say, God, here's this church to 5,000. God says, I never asked you to do that. That was for the guy down the street. No, Lord, I did it for you. He goes, yeah, you did it for you and me and you. I mean, you did it for yourself. And because you're comparing yourself. And again, these are deep inner issues. So I think a lot of our success that we're running after, it's just not in scripture. It's just not there. You got to make it, you got to put it there. But doing what God called you to do is clearly what's God saying. And actually, I recommend this to you too, Doug. I mean, there's a chapter I wrote in this, again, this recent Emotionally Discipleship book. It's called Follow the Crucified, Not the Americanized Jesus. I spent a few years studying the Gospel of Mark and John on how Jesus made disciples, on how he formed the 12. And I realized, he is calling them to reject success. Peter and the disciples had an idea of success in these kingdoms, and then be popular, and they'd be great, and they didn't want any failure or pain. They had a view of what this was going to be like, and Jesus said, no. To follow me, you want to reject success by the world standards, and be successful with me, which basically be my way. He goes, reject popularity with the world. Reject all that and be popular with me, and then reject greatness as the world defines it and be great with me, and embrace suffering and failure. Don't run from it. It's the crucified Jesus. And I realized, oh my gosh, I was like, it's so clear. It's in every culture and every time in history. We are just living in this unique age of, at least here in the United States and Europe, of just Western culture of just big, better, up to the right, and it's so deep in the culture that you're a failure. Why aren't you the biggest in town? Why aren't you making $1 million? Why aren't you, but you're 30 years old, you haven't made $1 million yet? It's just so interesting. And I think that the clash is with some really clear but radical biblical teachings that we tend to just cover over or not see because we're so immersed in the culture.
Yeah, that was so good. And similarly related, we can get so focused on work. One of the things you say in a sign of an emotionally unhealthy leader is that they prioritize ministry or work over their marriage or their single life if they're single.
Yes.
You mentioned you had your wife actually quit the ministry, which was
Yeah.
interesting. What have you learned about prioritizing marriage? You make a statement in the book that, marriage is the loudest gospel we'll speak, gospel message we'll have. What would you say to leaders when it comes to balancing work-life balance and putting their family first?
There's two different questions. I want to just focus on if you're married, but if you're single, it applies as well. That when Paul speaks about marriage in Ephesians 5, and he quotes Genesis, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, the two will become one flesh. But this is a great mystery. I'm speaking about Christ and the church. Paul can't talk about marriage without talking about it's a revelation. It's a mega mystery, is the word in Greek. It's a sign and wonder. Marriage is something that's going to pass away. But much like lepers are healed and the blind see and the dead are raised, those are signs and wonders that point to the kingdom of heaven. Marriage is meant to give a picture of the depth of the love of Jesus that offers the world. It's like the blind seeing and the lame walking, a revelation of the depth of the love of Jesus. Because there's no relationship on earth like a married couple that are one flesh and have a sexual dimension to it. It's the closest thing to abiding in Jesus, us in Jesus. John 17, I in you and you in me. May they be in us, he prays. John 17. Well, I'm in my wife's in me, not just physically, but emotionally. It's so deep. So if you've made a vow, because it's a vow, you only make one vow your whole life. After Jesus is going to be your vows. That means that you've made a vow that you're going to follow Jesus and lead for Jesus out of your marriage. You can't live as a single person anymore. So that means, again, it's a big discipleship issue to get trained in how do I be married. And the same will go for singles. There are some people who are celibate and called to be single, right? I mean, like vocational celibates, but others are just circumstantially single, widows, never got married. But living out your singleness is also a secondary vocation as a follower of Jesus that has its own kind of spirituality to it. So what it means is it's another limit that God's given you. If you're married or single, how do I live out my singleness as a sign and wonder? How do I live out my marriage as a sign and wonder, as a gift to the world? Not just so is your top priority? Of course it is after Jesus, because you made a vow. So Geri and I, and we began this journey, the marriage became paramount, and that we were living in the inner city. Well, we have lived. We're still there, and it was a hard place for Geri to live, and of course the pressure of pastoring. And so we had to restructure our life to begin investing in our marriage, which we'd never really done before, because we loved each other, but we had never gotten discipled in being married. It was just assumed if you love Jesus, it'll all work out fine, which is foolishness. And so, we began to invest in our marriage and then prioritize our marriage and function as one. And not that she became the lead pastor, but my discernment was flowing out of our marriage. If it was going to hurt our marriage, I wasn't going to do it. So that was it. I mean, it was just a done deal. And what God was speaking to her about was important to our decision. It was our decision, not mine, follow me type of thing. So it's a big thing. It's a big theology, and it's a very important leadership principle, tool, theology that does inform everything.
Yeah, you mentioned, limits, and embracing our limits, and marriage can be a limit as well. You make a statement in the book. You said, I wanted to do ministry at the unhurried pace of Jesus. The question was how. And I feel like there's been a lot of leaders in my generation specifically, maybe because of the work of John Mark Comer with his book, the ruthless elimination of hurry, of just, we need to slow down and, embrace Sabbath. And you speak a lot about this. And I'm just curious, what would your advice be to leaders when it comes to taking time to be still, to take a Sabbath, to take time away? What rhythms do you have in your life? What does that look like?
It's extremely difficult. Let's not kid for us. So slow down. Yeah. Right. So you're living in a world where no one slows down. You're living in a church culture that's no different than the world around us, especially a leadership culture. So let's not kid ourselves. We're talking about something that's going to take some time. So I want to just give you perspective, because then you'll get started. You say, it's not working for me. My life is still chaotic. So what we have done, what our work has done, is this whole journey will slow you down. We took a 4-month journey, sabbatical, to learn from monasteries about slowing down over about 20 years ago. And the goal was to learn from monks, Protestant, Orthodox, and Roman Catholic monks living in monasteries, about slowing down, about things like silence, stillness, solitude. And that's when we realized, when you live in that kind of environment, even just for a week, okay, you realize, oh my God, my life is crazy. And then we spent some years trying to figure out, how do we bring this to a missional local church in a place like Queens, New York, where we have 70,000 people on a square block and massive needs. So we began to translate or integrate some of the riches of church history into our missional local church in Queens. Things like the daily office, pausing to be with Jesus, not once a day, but 2 to 3 to 4 times a day. Silence and stillness was another big piece, beginning to lead people into silence. Sabbath keeping. We took the riches of a rule of life and began to teach people, how do I develop a rule of life where I structure my life around kind of the Benedictine categories of, prayer, relationships, rest, and work, with Jesus in the center. How do I begin to structure my life so that I'm able to abide in Jesus all through the day? That's the goal. So I think we need to create a culture. We got to create communities. We got to create leaders who can live it. So that's why for our work is, I know if I can't get the leader to slow down, he or she can't create a culture that slows down. It's got to come from the inside out, not the outside in. Everything grows from the inside out. And so I think we've got some, great free materials on our website. You can help me get started. Everything we're doing is getting you to slow down. So to feel your grief, Doug, is to slow down. Who's got time for that? We only get time to rest. I know some people, they only rest when they got a flu, or they're sick, which is really sad. God created us for rhythms. Key word for us is rhythms of work and Sabbath, and the whole world functions in rhythms. So I know that every day I need rhythm. After we finish this podcast today, I'm going to have a midday office, Doug. All right. I'm going to take some silence. I got a little devotional. I'm going to sit on my porch. I'm going to take 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to be before God. I just sit. Then I'll go back to work. This idea of rhythms is really, really important. So tomorrow I have a day off, do some unpaid work, and Saturday will be my Sabbath, where I stop, rest, delight, contemplate, read about that, practice Sabbath delight. And Geri and I will, do something pleasurable. I think we're going to see our grandchildren.
That's awesome.
But nothing related to work. But most importantly, delight in replenishing our soil. So this rhythm thing is so much a part of us now after all these years. We feel it when we're out of rhythm.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the rule of life? This is a tool that I know you all provide, and I thought this was extremely enlightening. What is a rule of life, and how can leaders implement it in their life?
So again, the challenge is, it comes out of, in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, there was a movement of men and women from Egypt and North Africa in particular that fled to the desert to get to God, to get cleansed of the idols in their heart so they could save the world, bring God to the world. They were living as hermits. But then over time, they realized they needed community. And so a guy named Pachomius came along and began to put these hermits were living in communities. Each community had a rule of life, which is, a rule was the ancient Greek word for trellis. Think of a trellis where grapevines grow upward and outward, and so they can be fruitful, versus a grape trellis that's just on a grapevine that's on the ground. It's not going to grow very big. So a trellis is a structure, a way they're going to structure your life so that you can bear fruit. So many, many, many communities live by a rule of life. Most are Orthodox or Roman Catholic. Some Protestant communities too. What we did was we took the rule of St. Benedict, which is the most famous rule in the West, and we, along with many other people, how do you do this for people who are not living in a monastery? And so we developed over time, it's all over time with much trial and error, a tool that would work in a church, for people who are regular people, and especially for leaders, to structure my day. So I actually, go on the website, you'll see on emotionallyhealthy.org/team, I kind of lead you through how do you structure a rule of life? How do you actually build it? It's free on our website, and it's worth looking at because, it just gets you started. Now, again, I think we have to build countercultural communities. That's my passion, because it's not just individuals here and there. I believe in the local church. I believe in the power of community to shape and reinforce culture. And we need leaders who will allow themselves to be deeply formed in their own inner life so they can then bring it to those around them. And we have communities that are radical places for Jesus. That to me is the great need, because the local church is the most important institution in the world. I truly believe that. And I love the local church. So I think living it individually is, you got to start as an individual, but you really got to build some people around you. So we're hoping, I think our ministry, we're trying to give some anchors to people, connections to people that kind of like, you can do this, we'll serve you as best we can to help you get started on this journey.
Yeah. Early in the interview, you talked about just how you wanted to disciple people well in the beginning of your journey, but it was shallow discipleship because you were a shallow person. You never spiritually or emotionally matured. We've been talking about how you actually do that throughout the course of this conversation. So once a leader starts to work through these things, how can they truly disciple those around them in some of these areas? What are some of the steps that they can take to help grow others, not just themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually had the same question as we were in it ourselves. Year 10, 12, 15, we were developing materials and stuff. And then we realized our church had grown, pretty large at that point. We needed to somehow put some stakes in the ground in our own culture to keep these truths and values in all aspects of the culture, from, worship teams, leadership, development, to small groups, to marriage and single and youth ministries, etc. So we developed a course that we call the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship Course, Part 1 and 2. And we spent some years working on this course that we call an introduction to this discipleship that deeply changes lives. And it's an experiential course. In other words, it's got theology, but it's theology that's meant to be lived out and experienced. So people learn to do silence and stillness and the daily office. So it's got two parts: emotional spirituality, and the other called emotional relationships. But it's not like other curriculums. This isn't like a small group curriculum. This is a course with homework every week. It takes 2 hours to do it. The leader has to get trained to bring it. And we tell people, do not bring it to your ministry or church until you get trained on how to do it. And so we provide some free training on our website. And then you begin to live it. You begin to get it into your life a little bit. Don't start teaching stuff you're not living, because then it's a program. We don't need a program. And the deeper it gets in you, the deeper it gets in people. It's a class, but there's a point leader, then there's table leaders, or tables of 6 to 8 people led by a trained table leader. So it's a very slow burn. It's not quick. Like, here's this program, like 40 days of purpose. Like, let's plug it in and play it and go, and our church will be changed. Like, no. This is a multi-year process, and it's going to be slow. And we ask people, please don't bring it to your church if you're not going to do it yourself. That's the American way. It's just deadly.
Yeah, this is huge. You actually, process-wise, it's funny. A mentor years ago gave me the book Changes That Heal by Henry Cloud, which is a great book. It really, really made a big impact on my life. And she said, make sure you buy the workbook. And I was just young and dumb. And I said, well, I don't do workbooks. Like, I'll just read the book and apply it, And she said, it must be really great to read all these books and not do anything with them. But like you said, that is our culture. And in the book, you actually said there's 5 steps to how we change. You have to become aware of it. We ponder it. We value. And then we realize there's a gap between our action behavior. And then we reprioritize. And then we can finally own it. And I think the temptation in the leadership world is, hey, I just read Pete's book. I got it.
Yep.
Next. Check. And so, leaders listening, we'll include links to all of this in the show notes. But I couldn't agree more, Pete. You need to dive into this process and actually do the work, or else you'll hit a wall like Pete did and like I did last fall. So, Pete, we have a few minutes left. Is there anything else you want to talk about with leaders today?
This has been great, Doug. You've done a great job. So, but yeah, encourage people get to our website. There's a little assessment that's really worth taking. It's 15 minutes. It's called Emotionally Healthy Personal Assessment, and just am I an emotional infant, child, adolescent, or adult? And we find it's a really nice way for people beginning in 15 minutes or so. They can do an assessment of where I am, and then you can start feeling like, okay, I got some big areas, and I help you identify what are the areas I'm really weak in. Because it's nice to get where I am as I begin this journey, and then where I hopefully will be later. And it's just a nice entry point because we're introducing you here in this podcast to a whole ecosystem, and it's a big ecosystem. But you want to start with you and where you are, and then take your first steps from there.
Yeah. Well, we ran out of time to go through the lightning round, but I'll finish with two fun questions. Yeah. One would, if you can go back and have coffee with 20-year-old Pete, what would you tell him?
Oh gosh. You've got to do a lot less speaking, teaching. I was an open air evangelist in the varsity, and you need a lot more time to get some help on your stuff because you're a mess on the inside. I mean, I didn't do feelings and abuse my family growing up. I needed to see a good Christian therapist, and the mentoring I was receiving was all skill based. How to be a better evangelist, how to teach the Bible better. It was all external stuff. I was good at the external stuff. And honestly, I felt like I got betrayed initially. Like, how could they make me a pastor? No one asked me about like my inner life. Like, no one, it's like they just took my gifts and just shoved me up there to get another church plant under their belt. And I almost got wrecked. So that's what I would say to myself, like, just don't listen to those people. Just want to, in a sense, almost using you to get more done. You really need space and time to work on you.
That's so big. On the other end of your life, when you reach the end of your journey, what do you hope people remember you for? What do you want your legacy to be?
I hope that, I hope I've mentored a few people, and that I gave people permission to be human and opened a door. I think my role, I believe, is like we're like seminal researchers and developers, and like God invited us to open up this thing for the church. I think that's our role, to open up this whole paradigm we call emotional discipleship, a whole ecumenical, broad way of looking at discipleship and leadership. And that now the next generation and the generation to follow are going to build on that and go beyond it. Our job and role was to open it up, that this became part of the normal conversation. Everyone's just talking about it. And then people developing their own. We've developed a lot of materials. At some point, our materials will be obsolete. Other people will develop new materials and they're going to build on that. That's my hope. We will have launched something that people are going to build on, not necessarily organizationally, but just take off from it, and do all kinds of creative, wonderful things.
Well, I know a ton of leaders that have already been impacted in that trajectory with your work. So thank you so much. And I hope this conversation today challenged some of the leaders listening to either start their journey towards emotional health or to continue and go deeper. And again, if you haven't checked out the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship or the Emotionally Healthy Leader or any of other Pete's books, make sure you do now. And don't just read it yourself, do the work and take your team through it, take the leaders you develop through it, and let's go change the world. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Doug. God bless.
Yep. Well, hey, leader, thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Pete. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can find ways to connect with him and links to everything that we discussed in the show notes at l3leadership.org/290. And as always, leader, I want to encourage you that if you want to 10x your growth this year, then I really want to challenge you to either launch or join your own L3 Leadership Mastermind Group. Mastermind groups have been the greatest source of growth in my life over the past 6 years, and if you're unfamiliar with what they are, they're simply groups of 6 to 12 leaders that meet together on a consistent basis for at least 1 year in order to help each other grow to their maximum potential, achieve their goals, and to do life together. So if you're interested in learning more about masterminds, go to l3leadership.org/masterminds. And as always, I like to end every episode with a quote, and here was a good one I thought from Gerald Brooks. He said this. He said, "If you want to stand out in a crowd, show mercy. Mistakes are common, but mercy is not." And I think everyone needs to hear that as well. Well, hey, Leader Lauren, I love you so much. We believe in you. Don't quit. You're making a difference. You're doing better than you think you are, and you matter more than you think you do. Keep making a difference. Keep leading well, and we'll talk to you next episode.